Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our presentation of Behind the Scenes, Music from the Washington Men's Camerata. My name is David Plyler, and I'm a senior music specialist in the concert office of the music division of the Library of Congress. And when the pandemic shut everything down in the spring of 2020, one of the first concerts that had to be postponed was the Washington Men's Camerata. We are delighted that after only a few years now of needing to schedule and reschedule this event, we are finally able to present it as a virtual event. I would like to give our thanks to Artistic Director Frank Albender for working with us so closely on the program and for sticking with it during all this time. We would also like to express our appreciation for the Verna and Irving Fine Endowment in the Library of Congress, which, together with the support of the Fine family, helped to make this event possible. Today, my colleague James Wintle, Head of Reader Services for the Music Division at the Library of Congress, is going to speak about and explore some of the rich manuscript holdings of music for men's chorus that can be found at the library. I will be sharing a few links in the chat in cases where we have digital holdings related to what James is speaking about, so keep an eye out for those if you want to explore further. Before we officially get started, I'd like to go over just a couple of necessary logistical matters. You all have the ability to customize your own view in Zoom, but we highly recommend that you keep it on speaker view. If you are not currently in speaker view, there's a button in the upper right-hand corner where you can switch. You also entered the room with your microphone muted for now. We welcome you to have a general conversation in the chat if you wish, but we may have time for questions after the presentation is over. So any questions that you have and you would like James to address directly, please place using the question and answer feature. If you're having any sort of technical difficulties, please send a direct chat to my colleague Damien by choosing Damien Eisminger from the drop-down list in the chat, and he will do his very best to assist you. Finally, this presentation is being recorded. We will not be sending it out via email, but it will be going out up on the library's website after a couple of weeks. So I thank you for your kind attention, and without further ado, please welcome my colleague James Wintle.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming to the virtual Library of Congress to see a little presentation about our manuscript holdings for music for men's choirs, specifically some of the pieces that are going to be on the program or are already on the program. That was done by the Washington Men's Camerata for the library. And they chose a really diverse and interesting program. So I'm going to go through a few of the pieces that are on there and show you through the magic of PowerPoint a few of the manuscripts that we have in our collection. I'll just begin by saying that the Library of Congress's music collections total upward of 25 million items. So there's quite a large collection of music here, and that includes archival collections, what we call special collections, that are dedicated to a particular composer or a particular organization. In terms of organizations, what will come up later is the A.P. Schmidt Publishing Archive, which has quite a bit of choral music in it, and a few pieces that made their way onto this program. So one of the great things about having access to a music collection that's that large is the fact that within that collection, we can, and you can, and any scholar can explore the idea of compositional process. We have a lot of drafts of pieces, sketches of pieces that later change in various ways to make their way to a published version that is then performed, and the version that we all know. So that can be interesting to look at where the ideas within a piece of music came from, and that's one of the things that we'll talk about, especially in terms of the Liszt fragment that's on this concert, which is an interesting programming choice to have just a fragment of a piece, but it is a particularly interesting one. And then we'll talk about that same issue of compositional process and sort of how things change from conception to realization when we're talking about the last piece on the presentation, which is a piece by Irving Fine. So just to set that up a little bit, we'll get on to Franz Liszt. So the first piece that I want to talk about is this fragment by Franz Liszt, a fragment for a piece for unaccompanied chorus, unaccompanied men's chorus that he wrote called the Vereinslied. And this is a very sort of celebratory piece. He composed 3 different versions of it. And the only published edition is the 3rd version, as you can see from what I have written on the slide here. And the setting that is in this fragment that you're going to hear on the Men's Camerata concert is particularly interesting because it seems to predate any of the known completed versions of the piece. And the thing about it is that it's very much an encapsulation of a musical idea. And we'll look at that more in depth in just a moment. But that's one of the reasons that this particular fragment is worth hearing and worth thinking about, even though it's just a few measures, as you'll see. But just a little bit about Liszt first. Liszt, as you can see, his dates are on the screen there, 1811 to 1886. He was known primarily in the early, throughout his career, but he focused on it in the early part of his career as a great piano virtuoso, and was one of the most popular performers in Europe in that early to mid 19th century. And so he was really inspired by Niccolo Paganini, the violinist, who played with a kind of reckless abandon that hadn't really been seen before, and was something of a rock star, what we would think of as a rock star in current times. And Liszt sort of took up that idea and wanted to do that with the piano. And he developed new techniques for playing the piano and different ways of going about it. And if you look at the history of piano technology, the expansion of the keyboard, the different mechanisms by which the piano works, that was often done in response to what Liszt was trying to play, and also he was responding to those technical innovations by writing music that took advantage of them. So he was very much in that world of the developing instrument and finding new ways to use it and new ways to exploit the latest technology that had become a part of that instrument. And so he was extremely popular. And one of the things that is interesting about Liszt is that he was not only writing music for the piano himself, but part of his performance style and the way that he would present himself is not only to play his own music, but also to play popular tunes of the day in transcription for the piano. So if there was a choral piece or a lied that was particularly popular, he would make a piano transcription of that piece and include it in his recitals. And this was also a way that Liszt was able to promote composers that he believed in and that he had befriended or had admired for one reason or another. And so that is where in our music collections, one of the choral pieces that's going to be on the program with the Men's Camerata actually comes into play. We have a massive collection of Mendelssohn manuscripts here at the Library of Congress. However, the men's chorus piece, Wasserfahrt, is not one of them. However, we do have a manuscript of Liszt's transcription of that piece among a very extensive collection of Liszt manuscripts and Liszt correspondence that has been digitized and put online. I have the link to the digital collection there in the PowerPoint, but I believe David will also put that in the chat so you can go there and explore some of the holdings that we have of Franz Liszt here at the library. So just a little bit about what Liszt was doing at the time that he wrote this particular choral piece. As I said, he had been very much the piano virtuoso, the performer. He was traveling around Europe, doing concerts, basically on tour for decades. Liszt, being a Hungarian, was very interested in promoting the music of Hungary and also assisting the people of Hungary. So there were times, for instance, there was a large flood in Budapest, and so he would go and put on a concert to help raise money for the people of Hungary who needed that assistance. So he was very much a social activist in that way, that he would not only promote himself, but he would also promote his country. He would also promote composers who perhaps weren't as famous as he, and used his position as this kind of megastar in music, not only to help himself, but to help other people as well. So that's what he had been doing for a number of decades in his life. By the time we get to the 1850s, 1848, I believe is the exact date, he decided that he had had enough of touring life. And so what he wanted to do was set down roots somewhere. And that place ended up being Weimar. He got a position as the sort of the court composer and orchestra leader from the Grand Duke of Weimar, set him up in a really nice place to live. He had an orchestra, he had a theater, he had everything at his disposal to make music the way he wanted to make it, and also to concentrate on being a composer. And this is the point in his life where he started writing much more orchestral music. He still wrote for the piano, but not in the same kind of volume that he had done previously when he was out doing a lot of performing. So he was concentrating on orchestral music. He was writing a lot of choral music at this time, and really just working on his chops as a composer, and finding the same way he was very innovative as a pianist and finding new ways to interact with the instrument. He was also he put that same energy into his compositions. And so when he was in Weimar, it put him in a position where he was able to have a full orchestra at his disposal, so he could do things like play Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique or put on a Wagner opera that he really believed in. And he was at this point in Weimar very much the central figure, in music in that area. And one of the interesting things about that is that he became involved in these kinds of compositional innovations that led to a kind of schism within Germanic music at the time. Germanic composers really took sides. This was something that was very much in the press and known as the War of the Romantics. And on the one side, you had what were seen as more traditional composers who were based in Leipzig, and that would be Johannes Brahms, Robert Schumann, Felix Mendelssohn. These are all people who admired Liszt, and Liszt admired them, but they had very different ideas about how music should proceed, basically in the context of a post-Beethoven world. That's really how they were all kind of thinking about it. Beethoven had written these 9 symphonies. He had written all these piano sonatas. He had taken music out of what was the common Viennese classical style of the 18th century and into something that was really new. His adventures in harmony, his adventures in form, all led somewhere, and where that led was the big question. So on the one hand, you have the more traditional composers in Leipzig, and that would be, as I said, Brahms, Schumann, Mendelssohn, etc. And they were writing symphonies, they were writing sonatas, the kinds of pieces with the kinds of titles that Beethoven wrote, using the same kind of sonata allegro form and various forms within the movements of those multi-movement pieces that Beethoven also used, right? So there's that more traditional style. And then there's the sort of progressive side of the War of the Romantics. And there you have Liszt, you have Richard Wagner, you have Hector Berlioz, people who are looking not just at classical composition as a kind of formal practice, but looking for a new way of thinking about those forms and how they might take shape in different kinds of pieces. And so one of the things that Liszt was particularly known for is taking the basic sonata structure. So you think of like a piano sonata, for instance, that will have 3 movements or possibly 4 movements, and they have, you know, a fast movement. It's not allegro form. There's a slow movement, there's a dance movement, and then there's a fast movement at the end that sort of may or may not harken back to what had come before, right? So there's this basic outline of what a sonata is. And so from Liszt's perspective, what he's saying is I can take those 4 movements, wrap them up into a single movement, still have the same kind of rhetorical ideas that come out in that music, but have it all happen in one continuous movement. And that's the thing that made his B minor sonata for piano such a vastly interesting and innovative piece. And it's also what led him to develop what we call the symphonic poem. And another aspect of the sort of progressive side of the War of the Romantics was that they looked beyond music for inspiration. So if you think about a piece like the Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique, that was kind of a watershed piece for this kind of idea, where you have a story that is being told through instrumental music. And the symphonic poem, which is what Liszt really innovated in his single movement orchestral pieces, and still is something that is done today. That symphonic poem, again, is this idea of an extra musical inspiration that is being expressed through the music. And so it's not just about thematic material that is then manipulated in various ways according to a formal plan, which is what you would find in classical period music, but the idea that the instrumental music can take on all kinds of different shapes, all kinds of different forms, all kinds of different colors to express this extra musical idea. And so whatever it happened to be. So that's one of the things that Liszt was really working on in Weimar. He was also working on extending tonality and working on this idea that he had of thematic transformation. So instead of dealing with, as I said before, the idea that music, the thematic elements in music developed according to a predetermined plan, that plan, according to what Liszt was thinking, could be altered to make things different, to move differently within the piece. And what he liked, instead of having a theme and a contrasting theme, was to have one big theme and then take little parts of it and spread out the development of those little parts of the theme throughout the entire piece. So it wasn't necessarily going to be theme A, do something with it, theme B, do something with it, maybe put them together and then have a recapitulation. He was saying, I'm going to have this theme and I'm going to take little parts of it and play with the theme in little parts and then put it all together and take it apart. And that's very, it's innovative. I say innovative a lot in this, but the reason that it's innovative, besides obviously it's different than what was coming before, it also sort of gives one, looking back from a 21st century perspective, it gives one the idea that, oh, he was kind of thinking in the same way that later atonal composers were thinking, like Anton Webern or Arnold Schoenberg. He was thinking about themes in kind of a 12-tony sort of way, right? What we would think of sort of taking the present day and sort of, putting it onto the past. It's the same kind of thinking. He wasn't obviously a 12-tone composer, obviously not. That wasn't for decades to come, but he was planting the seeds at this point in the way he was putting music together and thinking about how themes could develop and what could happen in a piece of music. So very, very interesting stuff from Liszt. And I want to look a little bit at these few measures of the Vereinslied that we have. Okay, that worked. Good. I was just having trouble advancing the slides, but I think I figured it out. Okay. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 measures. And there's one more measure that's on a second page, but it's just the same thing that's in the last measure here. So I didn't include it on the slide. But I don't know how much you can see this if you're looking at it on your phone or something like that. You probably can't see it at all, but take my word for it. This is what's happening. In the sketch, what the voices are doing are outlining a diminished seventh chord on F sharp. Starts on F sharp, A natural, C natural, E flat, F sharp again. So it's the first note of the diminished seventh chord, and then it resolves up to a G. Okay. And that's in the first tenor line. The second tenor line goes up to the A flat, stays there, and then resolves down to a D. And then in the bass line, he outlines the diminished seventh chord, goes down to a C, so returns to the previous note in the outlining of the chord, and then resolves down to a B natural. So he gets to a G major chord that is then held out for a long time. So what is happening in this piece at this particular time is that Liszt has been fooling around in E flat major and C minor, sort of going back and forth, playing with different diatonic harmonies, some non-diatonic harmonies within that basic key structure. So C minor and E flat major have the same key signature. They're what's called a relative major and minor key. So you can move between those pretty easily because you're not dealing with having to add a lot of accidentals. It's just a question of how the chords move in relation to each other, whether or not you're thinking in E flat or you're thinking in C minor. Okay, so what he's doing in this particular section is he's outlining this diminished seventh chord on F sharp, which is going to get him to C, which is going to then be a big cadence on the dominant. C, the dominant of C, which is G major, right? So that is where he's going. He's been playing around in E flat and C, E flat major and C minor. He's going to have a big cadence on the dominant of C and then move to C major for the next part of the piece. And we know that from how it plays out in the finished version, right? So what we have in the published version, as you can see, is a little bit different. He starts on a B flat, goes down and just outlines the top part of that diminished triad, A natural, C natural, E flat, and then resolves down to the G chord. So in the published version, what we have is something that's a little bit different, but the same kind of idea. You have a 7 of 5 going to 5 for the big dominant cadence. 7 of 5 is secondary dominant, meaning that you can have a dominant of the dominant in a key to strengthen the movement toward the tonic. So you have a secondary dominant going to the dominant, and then it goes to the tonic, which is C, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. But when you're looking at tonal music and deciding what's important and what's not, one of the things that you can do when you're looking at any score is to find the accidentals. You find the accidentals and you find the half steps. And those two elements in tonal music, at least, is going to tell you when something interesting is happening. Okay, so it's just kind of a trick of tonal music. If you look at a piece like this and you see, okay, there are a lot of accidentals on the page, that means something's happening. Either he's tonicizing a different key than the one he was in before, or the composer is moving from one key to another, or in this case, introducing a secondary dominant to strengthen a cadential pattern. Okay, so in this, you have a lot of accidentals, meaning naturals and flats and notes that are not within the key. That's what I mean by accidentals, if you are not familiar with that term. So when you're getting something outside of the printed key signature, right? So in the sketch, he outlines from the bottom this diminished seventh chord. And the thing about diminished seventh chords is that usually when you move from one chord to another, there's going to be one movement, like if you go from a dominant to a tonic, there's going to be one or two, if you have a seventh chord, half step resolutions within that chord. So dominant seventh chord, if this was just a dominant seventh chord on G, for example, you'd have G, B natural, D natural, F natural, right? Dominant seventh chord. And then the important part of that resolution from a G dominant seventh chord to a C major chord is going to be the movement from F to E and the down, F to E, and from B natural up to C. So those two half steps contracting into the major third is what's going to make that sound to a normal sort of normal perception. It's going to make it sound like it has come to rest, right? That's what resolution is all about. Dissonance and resolution within tonal music. It's tension and release. So those half steps within functional tonal harmony, those half steps are what brings that sense of rest to a piece, or either a sense of rest or a sense of movement or a sense of something important happening. So in this particular case, you have a dominant seventh chord, and the thing about the dominant seventh chord is that it doesn't just have those two half step movements. It has three half step movements. The F sharp resolves up to a G, the C resolves down to a B, and the E flat resolves down to a D. Okay, so you have a number of three different dissonances that have that half step resolution to get you to the chord you're going to. So that's a very strong resolution, and it sets up a lot of dissonance, a lot of kind of crunch in the chord, and then it goes to this major chord that then gives one a sense of relief, right? So here in the sketch, he starts on F sharp, he outlines the diminished seventh chord, like I said before, and goes up to the F sharp and then resolves it up to G in the upper voice, right? So he then takes care of the rest of those resolutions I was talking about, the E flat down to D and the C down to B. So he has all of those resolutions, all three of those half step resolutions happening to get you to the downbeat of that G major chord, which is going to be the dominant in this particular case, right? So he has a very strong resolution happening there. But the thing about this sketch is that it's not clear where he came from to get to this point, okay? The idea that everyone in this was starting on a G, like there had been some previous part where everyone was still singing in unison is unlikely, given what the rest of the piece is. It's very much full of counterpoint and really nice part writing, very singable part writing, and not a lot of just everyone singing in unison the same thing. So it's unlikely that this was coming from anywhere, really. If you look at the rest of the piece, the chances, I believe, are very strong that this sketch that we're looking at is in fact an isolated idea that he had of how to get, in this particular place, how to get to G for the big dominant cadence so he can then go to C. It's basically a harmonic exercise. How am I going to set this particular text? Treibt mächtig uns der Geist, right? The spirit drives us mightily. Or if you want to do like a literal translation, treibt is drives. Mächtig is strongly, right? Uns der Geist, to us, the spirit. So the spirit, Geist, the word spirit is obviously the most important word, but mächtig is the action word, right? So mächtig is how we're being driven by the spirit, mightily, right? So that's a very important word. And so what happens with the text setting in the fragment is that he outlines, like I said, he outlines this triad, but then he has the baritone voice come in with the text repeated, outlining the G major chord to reinforce that feeling of the dominant chord in the cadence. So you have Treib mächtig uns der Geist in the sketch with the high note on the downbeat and the word treibt on that downbeat. However, if you were going to say that, the word that really gets the emphasis is mächtig, because that's the really descriptive word in that phrase. And so in the version that actually came to print, mächtig is the word that is in that outlining of the chord that sort of reinforces the harmony that he's come to, right? So my thesis here is that the fragment is not part of a finished version of this piece. And this is just my own idea, okay? This is not something that I have absolute proof of. I'm just looking at this in terms of music. I think it's unlikely that there is more to this particular sketch where he's coming from something into this. I think this is a harmonic exercise to figure out how he wants to make this diminished seventh chord move to a G major chord so he can get to C. And what he comes up with is not the original idea, which is in the sketch, this outline of the diminished seventh chord. Instead, he starts on the B flat and makes it slightly more melodic, first of all, in that he's writing vocal lines, and this is something we'll see in a few other pieces that we talk about today, writing vocal lines that are more singable, right? Outlining a triad is something you do on a keyboard instrument. It's very easy to do on a keyboard instrument. You just do that. Singing, outlining triads or diminished seventh chords or whatever, very much like a vocal exercise. It's not really a melody, right? But he inserts a melodic phrase into this diminished, still the same harmony of the diminished seventh chord without the F sharp in it, but he still gets where he wants to go in a slightly more melodic way, and then changes the baritone reiteration of the harmony with the descending triad, shifts that from the baritones to the second basses, and moves the text over. So mächtig is the word that comes on the downbeat that gives you the emphasis on the word that is supposed to be emphasized in that particular phrase. So obviously the big idea here is Geist. That's what's happening in the held chord, the held dominant chord, but you have Treib mächtig uns der Geist, right? So you re-emphasize mächtig because that has not been on the downbeat before. So what I'm saying here is that his finished version of this piece actually is A, more singable, and B, better text setting than the original sketch idea, which is why sketches are sketches, right? When you look at the compositional process, when you're studying manuscripts, one of the things that is the most interesting to me is to see not only where ideas come from, but how they got where they were going, you know, how a composer is able to take a basic harmonic concept, like in this case, I'm gonna go from seven of 5 to 5 to 1. And how am I gonna get there? Okay, the first thing I want to do is use a diminished seventh chord, but how's that going to work exactly? Well, I need to make it slightly more singable, a little more melodic. So I'm going to do it this way, maybe leave out the F sharp and get to what is the finished version of the piece. It is very interesting to hear, as you will in this concert, to hear the first idea. But I'm sure that this predates any sort of finished version of the piece for the reasons that I went through. So this is just a lot to say about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 measures of music. I understand maybe not the highlight of the concert for everyone, but a very, very interesting peek at what Liszt was doing in Weimar at this time, which was really trying to become a great composer and really trying to find different ways to express himself harmonically and to get a sense of writing for choir, which is what he's doing here. So fascinating, I think, I hope you do too, little fragment of music by Franz Liszt. I happen to be a huge fan of the music of Franz Liszt. I really think that he, because of his fame as a piano virtuoso and a performer, that he often gets kind of shorthanded as far as talking about really fantastic composers of the time, because he was so famous, I think, and because his piano music is so hard and there's so much to digest there. But if you get into his orchestral music and also his choral music, the things that he was writing in Weimar, especially, there's a lot there to be discovered and a lot of really interesting things to unpack. So I hope that this just sort of gives you an idea of what we're looking at here, and also just sort of an idea of who Liszt was and what he was doing at this particular time. So the interesting thing for me about this concept of the War of the Romantics that I was talking about before is that there were two sides of this argument, as I said, the more traditional side and the more progressive side. And both of those camps of composers were both looking to the same place for inspiration, and that was Beethoven. And it's very interesting to see two opposing arguments, both taking what they would like to take from the same source material and saying, oh, this proves that I'm right. The fact that Beethoven wrote using these formal structures means that I'm right. And the other side would say, well, the fact that he used those formal structures, but he changed them in this way and that way, and did write pieces that had extra musical inspiration, that proves that I'm right. So they're both looking at Beethoven as a kind of musical deity, really, at this point, who was pointing the way toward either this progressive view of what music could be, or setting the stage for the more traditional views of people like Johannes Brahms and Mendelssohn and Schumann. And it's interesting because the same thing happened previously in music history at the beginning of the 17th century. There was a more progressive side of Italian madrigal composition and a more conservative side. And there were a lot of treatises and articles and various things written at the time about how this one side of the argument was blaspheming, against the memory of what had come before and all this sort of thing. But they both used Monteverdi in that case. They both used Monteverdi as the proof that they were doing the right thing. The more progressive side looked at certain aspects of Monteverdi's work, and the more conservative side looked at the more conservative side of Monteverdi's work. And Monteverdi was so multifaceted that he was able to inspire two different movements at the same time. And in this case, the same thing is true with Beethoven. And you see these kinds of these different points in music history where there are these kind of seminal figures that really deeply affect the composers that come after them. And in this case, it's Beethoven. And he was, Liszt was looking to Beethoven for inspiration, and so was, on the other side, Johannes Brahms. And so we're going to look a little bit now at Johannes Brahms. So we have, in Brahms's music, a great reverence toward Beethoven, but also a great reverence toward choral music. Brahms himself was a choral conductor. He led a number of choirs and was himself a musicologist, in that he studied the music of the past and went to libraries and looked at manuscripts of composers like Heinrich Schütz, like Johann Sebastian Bach, and studied the choral writing of these composers to try and make himself a better composer, the same way that he did with Beethoven. And with Beethoven, he was saying, well, I want to write a symphony, but how can I write a symphony when Beethoven has already written 9 symphonies that seem to encompass everything a symphony could be? And Brahms then decides to write his first symphony. It takes him 21 years to finish the symphony because of the weight of the legacy of Beethoven constantly on his shoulders, right? So Brahms was very much sort of weighed down by this legacy that he was trying to bring into the later, the later part of the century, and sort of existing in this post-Beethoven world. And how does one become an effective composer with that weight? And so that's something that Brahms really struggled with a lot. And one of the places where Brahms outshines Beethoven by miles and miles is in his choral music. Beethoven, not a great choral composer. He didn't really write for the voice. He didn't write things that were really singable. And that was something that Brahms could do like no one else. And one of the great pieces, he has a whole bunch of wonderful, wonderful choral music. And I encourage everyone to get as many recordings of Brahms choral music and go to as many performances of Brahms's choral music as you possibly can, because it is seemingly a never-ending sort of font of joy and beauty. So with Brahms, what you're going to hear on this concert is the centerpiece of his German Requiem. And the Brahms Requiem is one of those pieces that gets performed a lot. I used to, before I was a librarian, I was a singer, and I was did a lot of choral singing. I did a lot of solo singing, that kind of thing, and came to really appreciate Brahms. But the Brahms Requiem was one of those pieces that was constantly on the docket. Like if you're a professional choral singer or you're doing, gigs as a singer. At the time I was singing as a baritone, and I was doing the Brahms Requiem a lot, like just probably more than any other piece. So this is one that really is loved and is just really, really fantastic. And what you're going to hear on the concert is the centerpiece of that Requiem, in English known as "How Lovely Is Thy Dwelling Place." Right? It's the central movement of the 7-movement Requiem, and this piece is called Ein Deutsches Requiem, meaning the German Requiem, and that is simply because it's in German. The original language of the piece is German, but also the text of the Requiem is not liturgical. It's not a Latin mass. Like if you go to church and attend a Requiem mass, you will hear the same words in English probably these days as, say, for instance, Akagem or anyone would have written and set to music as a Requiem, right? Those words, the Verdi Requiem, all of those Requiems have the same text that is liturgical, in that that's just what the service of the Requiem Mass is, right? Those are the words to it. And they set it to music. Here, very different, non-liturgical. So Brahms is not allying himself with any particular denomination or type of church here. What he's done, and he collected the text himself from the German Bible, right? And he's taken biblical texts and set them to music in 7 movements, and calls this the German Requiem, because it's not allied with any denomination. It's just about sort of the loss that one finds in death, right? So he said that this is called a German Requiem, but it could just as easily have been called the human Requiem, because it's about people. It's not about a specific type of church, okay? And yes, he does use biblical text, so there is that connection with Christianity, but not with any particular flavor of Christianity. This particular manuscript, as you can see over here, probably very small. This particular version of the Requiem that we have at the Library of Congress in manuscript is a version called the London version, that is for piano, 4 hands, and chorus. And that is a version that's not performed that often. I have performed it before. I know of performances, and it's pretty easy to do. So if you have a smaller choir or not access to an orchestra, this is a fantastic way to go about performing this particular piece. And How Lovely Is Thy Dwelling Place is the central point in the Requiem. The text is from Psalm 84, and really gets to the heart of the matter. So if you hear this particular movement, you've heard the heart of the Requiem itself. So that is that particular aspect of the piece. And what we're going to do, since I've been talking too long already, we're going to go through a few of the Americans that are going to be on the concert. So here we have Amy Beach, Sea Fever. This particular manuscript comes from the A.P. Schmidt Publishing Archive, and that's where the manuscript is held at the library. It was written in 1931. It's a relatively well-known poem by a guy named John Masefield. It was set to music, perhaps more famously, by John Ireland in 1915, and Amy Beach would have known about that solo song setting, which is a very different approach to the piece. In this particular version, Amy Beach is looking at this poem as something that is happening in the present time, right? It's a poem about missing the sea. But what Amy Beach does with it is to give you a sense of the sea. The water is, the waves are rocking back and forth in the piano. She's using text to really bring out the danger of life at sea and the practical realities of being on a ship at sea, right? So she's really trying to paint that picture for you so you feel like you're on the boat and you're right there. The more famous setting by John Ireland is very much a kind of pensive view of this particular poem as a sailor thinking about how he wished that he could be at sea, and he wants to go back to where he has been. So on the one hand, John Ireland is treating it like a dream, and Amy Beach is treating it like more of a reality / nightmare, because being at sea is a really difficult thing to do. So it's a very different approach. And when you listen to this piece on the Camerata concert, I definitely recommend going back and listening to the John Ireland setting as well. Next, we have Arthur Foote, Hear My Prayer, O God. Foote is another, like Amy Beach, who was in this kind of early 20th century New England school of composition. He attended Harvard. He's also part of this A.P. Schmidt archive that I spoke about a little bit before. He is a very direct composer. Arthur Foote is, and I say this with great respect for Arthur Foote's music, is an extremely reliable composer. He writes music that is very accessible. It's very well crafted. You're not going to get a bad piece of music by Arthur Foote. That's just the way it is, because Foote really knew what he was doing. He didn't try to go beyond his means as a composer. He didn't try to be experimental or really go any place that, that was unfamiliar ground. But he was a craftsman who really put great music together. And this particular piece here, My Prayer, O Lord, is very much in that Anglican choral style. If you've heard much choral music by Charles Villiers Stanford, who's one of my favorite choral composers of all time, this is very much in that style. And the two of them were almost exact contemporaries. So shout out to Mr. Foote. Patti Stair here. We have a number of manuscripts by Patti Stair at the library, and she is from Cleveland. She taught and went to school in Cleveland, spent most of her life there. And here she's writing a piece that is on a text of Ben Jonson, and it's from a 1616 play called The Devil is an Ass. And this particular play, when it was written in the early 17th century, had songs. And this particular text, Have You Seen the White Lily Grow, was within the context of the play a song. The songs in the play were set to music by Robert Johnson, not the blues singer, but in fact an Elizabethan composer by the same name, Robert Johnson, who was really, you can see from his tablature printings that he must have been a very fine lute player and a very, very interesting composer of songs. So she's taken what was already a song and made it into something completely new. It's not particularly reminiscent of the Robert Johnson setting, but it is reminiscent of the style of the English madrigal. She uses some text settings, some melisma, some imitation, little touches that make one think of a madrigal, but still in a 20th century harmonic style. So next we have Samuel Barber, Heaven Haven, subtitled A Nun Takes the Veil. Originally, that was A Nun Takes the Veil and Heaven Haven was the subtitle, but he switched that around. This is a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, who is a very, very interesting poet who isn't that well known, or wasn't that well known in his lifetime, but has become much more revered in the decades since his death. And part of that is because of Samuel Barber's setting. This was originally a solo song that was extraordinarily popular. And then about 20 years after Barber had written the solo song, he made arrangements of the song for various types of choral groups, women's choir, men's choir, and mixed choir. And here we have the version for men's choir. So great piece. Samuel Barber, again, he's a really interesting composer. If I had more time, I'd talk more about Barber, because he writes music, again, like Brahms, that is extremely singable. He has a great sense of melody and a great sense of what the voice is capable of. He himself was a trained singer, and there are actually recordings of him singing some of his songs that you can find on the internet and various places. Really worth checking out. The theme here is the quest for solitude in nature. The idea that nature in and of itself is not necessarily a quiet place. You have to find that solitude, even if you're away from the city and away from everything. You still have to find that solitude within yourself, and then to have it to be able to find that in nature as well. You have to find it within yourself. So it's a very, very wonderful piece of music. Definitely recommend the solo setting as well. And then we get to McCord's Menagerie. And Irving Fine, again, New England composer, really interesting guy, was seen as part of this Stravinsky school that was centered around Boston, kind of a group of composers who were all very deeply influenced by Stravinsky. And this is true of Fine's earlier music. Fine, his style developed over the years. He went more toward an atonal style later on, and wrote some really interesting pieces that way. But even within that atonal style, never got away from his sense of lyricism and his sense of melody. Again, the recurring theme here is composers who really knew the voice and really knew how to write beautiful melodies. And that's what we're going to hear on this concert by the Men's Camerata is a lot of beautiful, beautiful melodies. And that's the thing that makes choral music so exciting, at least to me. So the McCord's Menagerie was written for the 100th anniversary of the Harvard Glee Club. When Fine was at Harvard, he had conducted the Glee Club, and besides being a composer, had studied choral conducting, had studied choral music, and that was very much a part of his makeup as a composer, was choral music. And so we have these 4 movements, and I want to just go through these a little bit. In the Irving Fine collection, we have a set of letters from Irving Fine to David McCord and vice versa. And I just want to take a second to read you those letters that will give us a little bit of insight into how they put these 4 movements together into one piece. The first performance of the piece was just 2, 3, and 4. The first piece hadn't been included yet in the first performance. And it says, this is from David McCord. Dear Irving, I hope you realize how proud and pleased I was to have such fine and distinguished music attached to my verses. It couldn't be better unless it will be with the addition of Vultur Gryphus, which will, I think, round it out and lift us out of the slime where lies the clam. For me, the clam seemed perhaps the most artistic, as well as the most original of the 3, and by artistic I mean dramatically so. Of course, the poem offers more than the other 2, though not offers more than the other 2, but not more, I feel sure, than the one about the condor, which is of Vultur Gryphus. You conducted them all beautifully. Cheered by all this, I went home and wrote the first of a new series, though the first example is not singable. And he writes in the letter here, you know the rhinoceros, but not the dinoceros. From this undulate herbivorous, the Lord will deliver us. I think that comes out pretty well. Gratefully yours, David McCord. And then a few weeks later, Irving writes back and says, Dear Dave, Many thanks for your letter of appreciation for the music which I have attached to your verses. They are, of course, the kind of verses to which I respond immediately, though I must say that they scarcely need the addition of music to delight anybody. And this is really true. The poems themselves are really just delightful poems, but the music does elevate them to a new level. What we need now is a really rip-roaring finale for the set, a fast and furiously funny piece that should last about 2 or 3 minutes at the most. Thanks again for the verse and the words of appreciation. Best wishes as ever, Irving G. Fine. And so what Fine is looking for is a different piece to end, but what he gets is Vultur Gryphus, which becomes the opening piece, and they do actually end with the clam, even though that is something that was apparently up for debate. And so we wouldn't necessarily know that unless we had the papers of Irving Fine here to illuminate what was happening within the composition of this particular piece. So this first movement of Vultur Gryphus, celebrating the condor, the last of the pieces to be added to the set. The wordplay here is kind of interesting. Gipfel und Spitzen, which means mountain peaks, Donder and Blitzen, which means thunder and lightning, and you will, of course, think of Donner and Blitzen being Santa's reindeer. But here he's sort of playing on that that idea to sort of give you a sense of the natural, drama of where the condor lives. And here we have that, where there's Gipfel und Spitzen, where there's Donder and Blitzen, there's condor, bald head and bare neck, there he is. The second movement of this piece is called the jerboa, and this describes the lesser Egyptian jerboa, which is a small rodent. And in that particular piece, the text is Jaculus, Jaculus, nothing miraculous. And I would have assumed that the scientific name of this jerboa was Jaculus, and he was just saying it over again. But in fact, the actual scientific name of the creature is Jaculus, Jaculus. So that's one sort of unit, right? And the greater Egyptian jerboa is the Jaculus orientalis. So there's two different kinds of these little rodents. And here he's talking about the Jaculus, Jaculus. So he's not just repeating the word, he's saying it twice because saying it twice is the actual name of the animal. So there you go. A little zoology lesson for you. The third movement is the mole. And here I thought the mole was interesting because in the mole, he rhymes mole with oversoul, right? So he's talking about what kind of soul a man has and what kind of soul a mole might have. And here he's making reference to Ralph Waldo Emerson's concept of the oversoul. Emerson, of course, also Bostonian, also went to Harvard, very much a sort of New Englander thing to think about. And here's just a little bit of the score of the mole. Man has an oversoul, but not the mole. What the mole has is not clear. What the mole has isn't clear, but it's an undersoul, I fear. So he lives under the ground, so he has an undersoul as opposed to an oversoul. How much Fine had drawn inspiration directly from Emerson here, I think, is unclear, but much like what kind of soul the mole has, you can never really know these things. But it's definitely part of his intellectual world and his heritage, his intellectual heritage as a New Englander. So the final movement of this is the clam, originally titled, as you can see on the manuscript here, if you can see the manuscript, Clam Chowder, or Who's Ooze. It's the only piece in the set that has non-musical sounds, the sounds of ships, and the poem is commenting on the evolution of man. We all began in the sea, but man got out of the sea and became man, and the clam is still there sloshing around in the sea. So it's a little bit of a speciesist sort of argument, but for you clam advocates out there, I'm sure it was meant in good humor. The clam is not what I am. He is what I was. I'm choosy. He's oozy. So the free will of man is sort of in the foreground here. And the fact that the clam is still just a clam, that we now eat in clam chowder instead of being part of his environment in the sea is kind of the point. So the ooze of the clam is where we're left at the end of McCord's Menagerie. And I just want to do one quick look at the Pianola d'Amore, the Concertate, which is from Choral New Yorker. This is really interesting because you can see in this piece a number of different versions of the piece that Fine went through before he got to the final version that we hear on the Men's Camerata concert. The piece as it stands now is an 11-page piece of music. The original Ozelid copy, where he's finished the piece and is making notes on it, is 19 pages. So there's quite a lot more to it that isn't performed regularly. There are a number of different drafts. One of those drafts, interestingly enough, has notations like a short score. So he has a piano and chorus score, but he's written in trombone here, violin here, trumpet here, with the idea that perhaps he was planning to orchestrate this piece at some point. And it turned out to be one of his most popular choral pieces, so I wouldn't imagine that would be too far out of the realm of possibility. So we have this idea of orchestration that comes in. We have two different verses that aren't part of the finished product that are set. And this piece in particular has very singable choral parts and a fiendishly difficult piano part. So a lot of syncopation and sort of jazzy rhythms and things in the piano, which he uses to great effect. But here in particular on page 10, what you see is how he gets from what is going to be a fully choral section of the piece and the little bow tie Arroyo and the Queen of the Can't Complain, for the bow tie Arroyo and the Queen of Can't Complain, is going to be a full chorus, but instead he decides, if you can see there, their pencil marks where he's cut out a number of the pieces or a number of the voices in the choir, and these become solo lines. And at the top, you see he's notated on the top line, the tenor is going to sing the first part, but then the second phrase is going to be in the bass or the baritone, which he has written up at the top of the page. It says bass, baritone, and pencil, and then he's marked out these other pieces, or the other voices, I should say. And here's just a quick view of some of the pages that were not used. Again, he's got another verse here: sing riding on the ferry, sing visiting the zoo, sing Appleseed and Cherry, sing Cup and Violet too, sing on the ferry, sing visiting the zoo, and then another fiendishly difficult piano interlude, and the Queen, and if in Queens or Como I hear you singing, I'll breathe the sweet aroma of another day. And so this is a whole other section not used at the end. Here you see Dal segno al fine, which means he goes back to an earlier point in the piece and goes to the end. So you have 19 pages of music here, plus 2 more pages of the piece are repeated. So quite a longer piece than was originally, or what we know of, a longer piece than what we know of was originally intended. It would be interesting to hear the entire thing at some point. So if anybody wants to take that on, you know where to find the rest of the music. And so this is just another view of how the original ideas that come out in a composition take root, perhaps in a longer piece, perhaps in a shorter just harmonic idea, like in the Liszt, where he has a harmonic concept that he wants to get into the piece, but he's not quite sure how to do it. Here, Fine has a vast array of ideas, a number of different things, so much music that he has to condense it down into something that's more palatable within the context of this piece, the choral New Yorker, which has multiple movements. This could have been a piece unto itself at the length that it originally was, but as part of the other movements, it had to be shorter in order to exist within that multi-movement context. So that's, I'm sure, part of the reasoning behind him taking what was this much longer thing and cutting it down. So in the Irving Fine papers here at the library, you can see this in action. All of his notes on these various versions of the score saying, this is where I want to cut, this is what I want to do, this is how I want to change it. So you see where he started, where he ended up, and a lot of what happened in between on these notated scores. And that's just one of the ways that you can use the manuscript material at the Library of Congress to study music and to really hone in on the compositional process that is documented in these archival collections and in the manuscript collections that we have at the library. So I've run over time here, but we may have time for questions. I don't know. David, what do you think?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we're out of time for questions unless somebody has a quick one. They want to put it into the question and answer section. But first of all, I mean, thank you, James. I've left just so everybody knows, I've left a link to the library's performing arts page in the chat that could connect you to our catalog, digital collections, concert schedule, and our Ask a Librarian feature if you have further questions about any of the things that James has talked about or anything else that may come to mind. You can also navigate your way there via loc.gov. And so I think maybe we'll just leave it with thank you, James, for these fascinating insights into these pieces. With you, it's really, it's always walking in a Wintle wonderland, as I like to think of it. And we thank everybody else for attending this webinar about Music for Men's course at the Library of Congress. We look forward to seeing you at the library, either in the reading rooms as a researcher or at one of our events. We hope to see you soon. So thank you everybody for your